Before we get to the episode, this November is the 4th anniversary of Talk Music Talk. I'll be celebrating the occasion on November 26th at the historic Strand Bookstore in New York City at 7:30 p.m. with three of my favorite past guests, Melanie Charles, Public Speaking, and Grandkid. Each act will perform, and I'll also be interviewing them live. This event is free to the public and held in Strand's beautiful Rare Books room. Again, that's Monday, November 26th at 7:30 p.m. For more details and to RSVP, head on over to strandbooks.com and click on the events page. And of course, I will put this in the show notes. Hope to see you there. And now for the episode. Hello there, and welcome to another episode of Talk Music Talk with Boyce. I am your podcasting host, Boyce. Thank you for listening. For the first-time listener, Talk Music Talk is a weekly music interview podcast where I have long-form conversations with people connected to music from different genres and different backgrounds, established and emerging from all different genres, singers, singer-songwriters, music therapists, music journalists. And speaking of music journalists, on this episode, a returning guest, Jesse Jarnow. He has a new book out. He is the author of 3 books, one on Yo La Tengo, Grateful Dead, and the newest one on the Weavers out Election Day. It is called Wasn't That a Time? The Weavers, the Blacklist, and the Battle for the Soul of America. As I said, this is his second time on Talk Music Talk. I interviewed him back in January 2016 on episode 65. That was before the release of his book on the Grateful Dead, which was called Heads, a Biography of Psychedelic America, out now on paperback. Listen to that episode because you can get the whole Jesse backstory. Of course, I will put the link in the show notes for you. In this conversation, we catch up and what's been going on with Jesse since the book of the Grateful Dead came out. And of course, we talk about his Weavers book, why he wanted to write it. We get into the story of the Weavers and being blacklisted and how a pop folk group from the 50s speaks to our current political climate. Even if you're not familiar with the Weavers, even if you don't like folk music, this is still a fascinating story and a great book. And also, Jesse will be talking about some of his favorite recent music books. All here in a great conversation. Here it is, without further ado, my interview with Jesse Jarnow. Enjoy. As we were talking before we started recording, we realized it's been, 2015? I interviewed you pre your Grateful Dead book.
Yeah.
How have things been since then?
Really fantastically busy. Thank you for asking.
Mm-hmm.
The last time we spoke, I was still probably in the throes of working on that book, which was Heads, a Biography of Psychedelic America, which just came out in paperback in September.
Congrats.
Thank you very much. And now I've got a new book that's coming out called Wasn't That a Time? The Weavers, the Blacklist, and the Battle for the American Soul. And I've been doing, all kinds of freelancing and other projects since then. I'm, still hosting my my weekly radio show on WFMU here in the New York, New Jersey area. And, staying as busy as I can. Yeah. And very thankful.
Cool.
As well.
Yeah, busy can be very good. So when you release the Grateful Dead book, that now adds you to the canon of Grateful. Like, how do you, what is the response to the book and
Heads,
added to the canon of Heads books?
I mean, it's been incredible. Probably around the time I started talking to you, I talked to you last time, I started writing liner notes for the Dead as well, which has been just an incredible honor. Both just getting to do that and the fact that the Grateful Dead have a fan base that still values buying releases that have essays in them. But sort of being part of the Dead world there's this real extended family aspect to it, which I was, sort of part of before that anyway. It's been really cool. It's definitely found an audience out there in the Dead world, and and in the the psychedelic world beyond the Dead world that's not connected to the Dead. Okay. There's been this incredible renaissance of psychedelic research over the last half century, but in these last 2 or 3 years, or 4 or 5 years at this point,
all these books.
There's been this, this explosion of books, but also, this explosion of scientific studies and conferences, and just kind of this new acceptance that psychedelics have this real, legitimate value and aren't just this, frivolous hippie thing, but, can lead to lasting change, can have this, incredibly formative, impact on people's creativity. And they've really moved into the mainstream in terms of things like microdosing and Michael Pollan's new book and stuff like that. Yeah. So being able to, I kind of completely inadvertently chose this really great moment to write this book about the history of underground psychedelics, exactly as they were kind of coming out of the underground and back into the mainstream for the first time. So it's just kind of, I've ended up in kind of this interesting little, position. It's been a busy few years. It actually ties into my new book about the Weavers as well. 2 of the 4 Weavers, Fred Hellerman and before him Ronnie Gilbert, were very early LSD therapy patients. Okay. Not very early, but early in the sense that it was before it was illegal, in 1962 and 63 and 64. And it's interesting to me sort of seeing the way that the story of the Weavers, this this folk band from the the 40s and 50s and early 60s, sort of connects up at the other end with kind of the beginnings of the psychedelic movement and kind of the moment where folk music hits rock and roll and that. So it's been an interesting experience, kind of piecing together this sort of long arc history of like American counterculture, I guess.
Well, how did you find out about the Weaver story and being blacklisted? Like, what was the genesis of that?
The genesis of that was that my mom played me lots of Weavers records when I was very little. The Weavers were really, quite literally, my first favorite band when I was like age, 3 or 4 or 5 even. Pete, she played me Pete Seeger records as well, but it was the Weavers that I really connected with. And he was Pete Seeger, this towering figure in American music, and the Weavers were his band, and that's how he came into the mainstream. And I love Pete Seeger's records, but some of them. But there was something about the vocal blend of the Weavers and just the energy of the Weavers that really grabbed me as a kid. There was this, my second favorite band after the Weavers was the Beatles, and there's a very similar sort of giddy, positive energy and amazing harmonies that kind of are similar traits between those two bands. So the Weavers were deeply part of my personal history. I actually, one of my very earliest childhood memories is going to see the film version of the movie of Wasn't That a Time, which is a documentary about them that Jim Brown made in 1979 and 1980. And my parents took me to a theatrical release of it, and my mom had to promise the ushers that I would behave through the movie, which I apparently did. But then I sang along, according to my mom. So I guess I knew all the words at that point. But the Weavers, discovered the Beatles at age 7 or whatever it was, and, moved on into being interested in rock and roll and lots and lots of other music. The Weavers kind of went by the wayside in terms of, my own kind of personal canon. And sometime in college, maybe, probably when I went back and excavated my parents' record collection, I kind of started listening to some Pete Seeger records again. The Weavers records are actually kind of, because they were my favorite records when I was a kid, they're kind of really beaten up. My parents let me control the turntable arm and the needle, and it was really not a great idea in terms of keeping records preserved. So the Pete Seeger solo records lasted better than the Weavers ones. So anyway, I started revisiting him in college and just after college, and sort of him and his story sort of hit their way back into my my canon of American music and understanding of the history of this country. And did some reading about him at the time, and actually got to interview him, Pete Seeger, about copyright. It was kind of probably, was it like 2003, 2004, when kind of this notion of copyright and Creative Commons and whatever was very prevalent on the internet, and especially sites like Boing Boing. And I wanted to sort of get his take on what that meant, sort of how he saw folk music and kind of in the sort of early technological bloom of the 21st century.
Because that was different with folk music, where it was kind of okay to take someone else's song.
Yeah, well, yes and no. That's a very loaded topic when you talk about folk music, and the Weavers were very much called out for that back in 1950. You see a lot of these same conversations now about what it's appropriate to do and whatever. And that was really the forefront of the dialogue back in the Weavers' original era. And the thing is, then as now, there are no perfect answers to any of these things. You just how to make something fair if you happen to be the person who turns an obscure, in the Weavers' case, like a South African song into this global hit. What's the most fair way to compensate everybody and to acknowledge that, and then the Weaver song, which is "Whim Away," became "The Lion Sleeps Tonight," which became an even bigger global hit, and it just gets so thorny and so messy when you get in terms of basically when lawyers get involved. If it's just people singing it in a folk club, it's not a huge deal, but once it becomes recorded,
and people are making money off of it.
And the thing is, nobody, people keep getting screwed. It's just not, we've had way more than half a century to figure this out, and it's still not.
Yeah.
Anyway, so I was interested in Pete Seeger's perspective on that, and I'm not sure he had a totally, internet savvy, technologically informed opinion about the way things have evolved, but it was amazing to talk to him, and he's still even though he wasn't plugged in, technologically like that, there was still this part of him that was so present and curious about the modern world, and all just, we did the interview and it took maybe 15 minutes, and then that turned into a conversation about Brazilian music, and then that turned into a conversation about public infrastructure in Brazil, and somewhere I have on tape, basically Pete Seeger telling me about the bus system that got evolved in Brazil to help serve the city centers in a more efficient way, and it was really inspiring to hear how present he was, and that was something that struck me throughout researching and writing the Weavers book and going through their old interviews and correspondence, is that these are people who were born really in the very first part of the 20th century, but you read their words now and their attitudes and sort of the conversations they're having with each other and then the world, and they're really they're modern people. They would come out in exactly the same place on the political spectrum if they were still alive today, and none of them are. The last two of them passed away a few years ago. But I read them and it's just they don't really have any, sometimes you read interviews with people from the 50s and 60s and it's oh, that's an unfortunate take or something like that, or it's sort of skewed by the perspectives of the era, and really there's definitely I don't know, there are definitely some little slight issues in the general sense, but for the most part you read them and it's just they would be they would be voting for Bernie Sanders. They would be voting for somebody to the left of Bernie Sanders and be out there campaigning for that person. They'd be supporting every pronoun right, any progressive thing you want to put out there. I can say with pretty much absolute certainty that all four members of the Weavers would have been right on board with it. And that's a really empowering feeling to find these people kind of in the pages of history who are, sort of far, distant to this present moment, and find these people who are so alive and real and kind of part of this continuum of progress is not quite the right word, but fighting for progress. Yeah. And that it's great to find things like that where it's like these are people who are like, they're allies or whatever you want to call them.
Well, did the music from, sometimes you hear music that you loved as a child and you hear it as an adult and you're not sure what you saw, and did it still connect to you
absolutely.
as an adult?
So listening to the Weavers now, there is something kind of a little bit corny about it, but that's almost by design in the sense that they were a pop band. They were all really committed left-wing progressive people, but the idea of the Weavers is that they wanted to be this accessible pop band and kind of bring in a very coded way these ideas about where culture comes from, and bring those to the mainstream in a way that was like an accessible package. And to them that meant bringing the idea that music to them came from people. It didn't come, because that was the era of the hit parade where pop music very much came out of offices and record companies, and not as much out of just songs that emerged naturally, which is from songwriters who were also the singers, and the Weavers weren't necessarily singer-songwriters in that sense, but we're really like tapping into kind of these traditions of great songs. So those, listening to them now, their ear for great songs really comes through. They're the first people to really make Sloop John B into a pop song. Or, like I said, Whim Away, which became The Lion Sleeps Tonight, which is a very different song when the Weavers did it, because it doesn't have any English words. Yeah. It's just this a cappella thing, basically, with a little bit of banjo. So that inventiveness really came through, and their sense of fun absolutely really came through. Even if there's a little bit of kind of the hokey sort of cornbread 50s thing going on as well. There's still this energy of them as humans. It's kind of in the same way that the early Beatles when they're with the mop tops and singing the love songs, they're singing Love Me Do or She Loves You, or kind of these basically sweet little ditties with winks of salaciousness in there. But even though that's the surface message of it, that's not the deeper, that's not the energy that the Beatles were bringing. And that about the Weavers, that even though the surface of it is this kind of, a little bit hokum, there's still this force of life behind it that really carries through. And the songs are just so catchy.
Which kind of separates them from the groups that were influenced by them and that were more about cashing in.
The
pop movement.
The Weavers. So the Weavers were an enormous global pop success, and I'm saying that mostly because most people don't necessarily remember the hits of the 1950s now. And really were triggered the folk boom, the several folk booms that followed them. There was a folk boom that followed them initially in 1950 when they had their first hits with Goodnight Irene and Whim Away and songs like that. And there was a real trend towards that music and folk sort of coming into pop music, and things like, sort of waltz country tunes, things like that. And, there was a boom in sales and acoustic guitars and that kind of stuff. And then this, boom that followed with the Kingston Trio, which was the late 50s. And that's when it became this really very commercial thing. And the thing is, it's the Weavers were that as well. They were, they weren't playing these authentic arrangements that were true to, wherever the songs came from. They were doing things that were very arranged with Gordon Jenkins, who is one of the hugest band leaders of the day. Somebody I really didn't know anything about when I was a Weavers fan. That was a whole new story to me, though probably not to Sinatra fans and aficionados of 40s and 50s pop music.
But I didn't know he worked with folk.
He didn't really work with folk. He worked with the Weavers. There was something that he saw in them that was not folk music. I mean, he liked that, but that's not I think he saw that same sort of force of spirit that, it's really cool to hear them harmonize. They're not perfect harmonies in the way that, like a trained pop singers were perfect harmonies, but they're, the energy of them was so overwhelming. They had incredible ear for picking these songs and creating these really incredibly stark arrangements, like really just guitar and banjo and 4 voices, and that's that's it. And they did a lot with just those tools. And then Gordon Jenkins would come in and kind of write these
augment.
but
beautifully augment.
And then they had other arrangers who were significantly cheesier than Gordon Jenkins. Not that Gordon Jenkins was a paradigm of minimalism or anything, but so the Weavers were a pop band. But then you get these bands like the Kingston Trio, who I'm not a huge Kingston Trio fan, though. I found a couple of songs of theirs that I like. They don't quite have that same I keep using the word energy, but they don't quite have that same force of intent behind what they're doing, and there's sort of a different end game or a different end point where it's like, they kind of have the cheer of the Weavers, but with the Weavers there's always this kind of discordant note behind that cheeriness because of the Blacklist and because of sort of how they developed these musical ideas, which very much came out of the Communist Party and socialism and progressive politics in the 40s. And it kind of, the Weavers themselves were blacklisted in the 50s, in the early 50s, and that runs under everything they do. So like you listen to like a live Weavers recording and there's this sort of goofiness to it, but there's every now and then there'll be like a joke about the Blacklist or a joke about not being able to get a job or something that just adds it, that you just remember that there's this dark undercurrent there, and that's not there for the Kingston Trio and not there for so many of the acts that followed them. Yet it also kind of informed this idea that folk music is serious. That there's, even though there's this, there's the Kingston Trio are goofy and collegiate, there's still this like somewhat pretentious sense of we're doing something that's noble by making folk music. And the Weavers worked very hard to try to find that balance between all of those things, and that idea of seriousness really is what carried through the folk boom in the late 50s when the Weavers reformed and when the Kingston Trio had their huge hits, and then that was the world that Bob Dylan and Joan Baez came out of and were reacting to. That's like a Rolling Stone, in the sense that it was controversial or whatever that Bob Dylan went electric, was very much an answer to not necessarily the Weavers themselves, but to the whole milieu that they created. Okay. Though there's an I think it's in Bob Dylan's Chronicles. I think he mentions this, that Ronnie Gilbert from the Weavers introduced him at one of the Newport Folk Festivals, and her introduction was like, "Take him, he's yours," and it was a very affectionate intro at the time. But there's a Dylan quote, I think it's in Chronicles, where he says, "Well, what did she mean by that? Like, who do I belong to?" Yeah. And so there really is that, like, that sort of that moment, when the Beatles come around and Dylan goes electric. That's sort of, the beginning of what we think of sort of the modern music continuum, and the Weavers are kind of at the very, very end of the last historical, epoch or whatever you want to call it. So that was a huge, interesting part of it to me, was kind of reconstructing this, what feels now in 2018 like a really lost world.
Well, talk about...
that was a tangential answer.
No, it's good. So talk about what the general conceit of the book is about.
Yeah, I mean, it's the rise and fall and rise, again, of the Weavers. And this I'm going to go back a couple questions ago and sort of where the genesis of the book came from. I got back into Pete Seeger in college. Did that interview with him kind of early in my journalism career, and just, kind of he's frequently on my mind since then, to the point where after I finished my previous book, the one about psychedelics and the Grateful Dead, I started thinking about other topics that I had strong emotional connections to that didn't seem to be covered by other books. And I came across the Weavers and mentioned it to my editor, who's, whatever. I love the Weavers too. I love Pete Seeger, but I don't think that's not for us right now. No, thank you. And then the election happened in 2016, and I just could not stop thinking about the Weavers. And like suddenly, I'm looking at Twitter every day, and there's blacklists on both sides. That's just such a major tactic in politics right now. Is so and so is on such and such a channel, and we can't watch that channel anymore. Whether or not that's a left wing or a right wing thing, it's
or a human.
Yeah, it's just a human thing. And just the idea of like revenge politics, which is what really the Blacklist was just on the forefront of my mind. From the day after the election, basically since November 10th, 2016. At which point I mentioned it to my editors, like, oh yeah, let's write about the Weavers. Let's do that. So the conceit of the book for me is that it's telling this very lost story of the Weavers and reconstructing this strange pop world of the 1950s. But also, people think of the 1950s as this very black and white thing, Leave It to Beaver, and there's really all these, a gazillion like stereotypes about the 1950s and how bland and boring it was. And to be fair, a lot of the 1950s, the popular culture of the 50s was pretty bland and boring, and I could see people easily, brushing the Weavers into that. But I really wanted to like illustrate that it wasn't, that there was this dark, weird, strange beast underneath American culture, and it's the same beast that's always been there. That's that's making the country so bizarre these days, but was really very present and visible in that era. In a way that, like, looking back at it, feels like I've been saying, just very current and very just like you see the same arguments being made. You see America first, like like I can't like reading, researching the book, just seeing what that phrase was associated with, in World War II and the 50s, and seeing that it's now this phrase that's come back and means exactly the same thing with all exactly the same forms of hatred is just mind boggling to me that we're not beyond that. But yeah, illustrating those parallels, but also sort of showing how the Weavers kind of found their optimistic singing path through all of that awfulness. And showing how that's still a path. It might not take the form of singing together, singing folk songs in harmony, but the idea of using music as this organizing force, as a power against oppression, is to me like as real as as it's ever been. And there's if you Google what happened to all the protest songs, that's always that's like a popular think piece kind of title. I think is completely the wrong approach and the wrong question. And the idea of music as a social force is, to me, it's an organizing force. It's not necessarily like a critiquing force. It can be, and very effectively, but that's only one way it serves. And this idea that music as something that brings communities together and connects people across the world is I can't tell you how vivid and real that is to me.
And isn't that the real fear that they were communists, is that they're singing these songs, gathering people together, possible communists. So that was the fear.
Well, I mean, they were communists. Well, yeah, they were absolutely communists. I mean, and that's the thing
that gets condemned for being.
So the Blacklist, the fear, or at least the public fear, is that communists are they were connecting to espionage, and the idea that these American communists are going to blow up the American government or take it down from the inside or whatever awful thing you think the communists are going to do. And there was, in fact, communist espionage in the 50s, but it was not members of the American Communist Party. The American Communist Party, as the group that sort of indirectly produced the Weavers, was, the equivalent of, I don't want to say the Green Party, but it's it was the far left option in the 1940s. If you were somebody who is progressive in this country, the same way that there's been this like renaissance now for socialism, for the Democratic Socialists of America, and for fine reason, that was the world. Like if your political beliefs are to the left of Hillary Clinton, you probably would end up as a communist in that era. And then, like I said, this sort of politics of revenge happens, and communism becomes this slur that's that's just blown out of proportion for what their belief system was. And the American Communist Party, as Pete Seeger belonged to it, was the idea of transforming the country from within. It was transforming the country through democracy. And that's not, and bending the country towards more liberal spending patterns and, social services. And really, it was just a continuation of what FDR did during the New Deal. And that was, obviously the New Deal was several bridges too far for a lot of people in this, a lot of right-wing people in this country. But I just don't see how it's disputable if the New Deal was also the most, triggered the most prosperous and like culturally adventurous and supportive time in this country's history. So it's I have a hard time getting my head into the enemy on this one, into the other side on this one.
Well, how bad did it get for the Weavers?
They had to break up. They were being harassed on the street. They, they would go to hotels, and the desk clerks at the hotels would say, you have to leave if there are more than two of you in a room, you have to leave the door open so you make sure you're not conspiring or things like that. They're all harassment. Yeah, people calling them at home. People like they're. The biggest one. This was pre Blacklist, but having stones thrown at them. The Weavers didn't perform at this. They were supposed to, but it didn't end up happening. But there was a incident of Paul Robeson, the amazing singer, singing in New York in the Catskills, and Pete Seeger performed that day, and there was a whole. It's a long story. It's the basic. It's a whole chapter in my book is kind of built around it. But the day ends with them leaving the concert site in buses and having people lined up with stones, whipping them through the windows of these buses while the police kind of either sit on the side passively, or in some cases, as I think Time or Newsweek reported, actually participate in this race riot, basically, where people are getting stoned. And it's, I don't know, I'm still getting chills thinking about these things that the Weavers did face against.
Yeah. How was it that they were, so they were getting like banned from clubs and this was happening, but they were still having hits on the radio?
So there's sort of this chronology in that that incident happened the Weavers sort of existed when that happened. They were called the Weavers and they were singing, but they hadn't really established themselves yet. So in the fall of 1949, they started singing at the Village Vanguard in New York, which is where Gordon Jenkins discovers them and long story short, brings them into Decca Records. The Weavers had been blacklisted sort of previously in when Pete Seeger was in the Almanac Singers, which was his band with Woody Guthrie, and they got in trouble for. They got in trouble. It's probably too complicated. It's a sidetrack here, but the Weavers. So the Weavers basically, the way they describe it is they kind of snuck in under the radar. Okay. Is that Gordon Jenkins kind of snuck them in as these hit makers, like. So Decca Records, who put out their first records, their first singles, initially didn't want to sign them and made them go through Gordon Jenkins. So the first Weaver singles that became huge hits were presented as the Gordon Jenkins Orchestra featuring the Weavers. And if it's just a single build like that, you have no idea who these people are necessarily. It's not, there's no... They didn't have like a radical program. They weren't like the MC5 where they would come out on stage and kick out the jams motherfuckers or any of that. It was very, they were really trying to package themselves as this innocent pop band kind of. There was maybe a little bit of deception in that sense. And they had, kind of had these huge hits, but pretty quickly people were kind of sort of putting the pieces together.
Yeah.
So there are these little early incidents of them getting blacklisted, like, kind of when Goodnight Irene starts to become a hit, they got offered a TV show. They were going to host a TV show. And then there was like a minor little upcry, and that show got pulled away from them. And then they had a few more hits, and then it sort of escalated.
Yeah.
And I think the answer to that question, at least as you asked it, is that there was an underground right wing media that's very much, they had kind of these newsletters that sort of eventually were what brought the Weavers down, but there wasn't quite that same sort of viral mania where something would just like somebody's like, oh, that person's a communist, and then the next day they're but as close to that as you could get for the media in the 1950s. Their heyday was really short. Their first hits were the summer of 1950, basically 1951, and then by the beginning of 1952 they're done. Or, well, they continue on to the end of 1952, but by the beginning of 1952, they're having stands at clubs canceled. That's when people start testifying erroneously against them, and they by the end of basically by the middle end of 1952, they're more or less broken up and stay broken up for the next 3 or 4 years, and kind of all go off and think the Weavers aren't. They had no plans to reunite when they broke up. It wasn't we're going to ride out the storm. It was we're done. And
then the Carnegie Hall was that the comeback kind of.
Yeah, they had the comeback in 1955. At December 1955, their manager Harold Leventhal, who I'm sad I started this book as late as I did because several of the key people sort of passed away right in the 2 or 3 years before I started doing this. And by all accounts, Harold Leventhal was just a saint and just a folk Buddha. And I really wish I could have talked to him. But so Harold Leventhal, as the story goes, and who am I to doubt this story, asked the Weavers if they wanted to reunite, and all 4 of them independently said no. And so he asked them again individually and said, oh, the other 3 want to do it. And convinced them, basically told them that the other 3 were down. And at that point, they're like, oh, okay. So tricks them all into doing it. Can't book them into Town Hall, which is their usual place where they would play in New York, which is, not small, but not big. And decides to go for the broken, book Carnegie Hall, the big room, not having any sense of whether people really want to come see the Weavers or not. It was just, he just felt it was time. He kind of, maybe had could kind of guess, and it just sold out instantly. Yeah. And it was just, people were, lying down the block. Like they had to book a couple more shows in the spring to sort of fill it up to kind of get everybody in. And just from that, the Weavers were really like after that, their record company didn't re-sign them, and they became this very underground phenomenon in the late 50s, where they were actually partially responsible, as much as anybody really, for kind of the shift in pop music from 45s to LPs. People talk about how Sgt. Pepper was kind of the shift from the singles market, but the Weavers put out a live album from their Carnegie Hall reunion show on Vanguard Records, which was the beginning of kind of the youth market buying LPs. Before that, it was really a singles thing, and the idea that there was like an LP that was like this extended performance that was more than just like one song. Again, sort of this idea that there was something serious about folk music. Yeah. They signed Vanguard Records, who they signed to, was really predominantly a classical label and a jazz label. Both these kinds of music carry these certain weight to it. And the Weavers kind of brought that idea into the late 50s and popularized this idea of like a live album as this important document. and really made the LP like the standard form of communication for folk music. So in the late, really have this very pioneering, simultaneously underground and, underground in the sense that it's college students and kind of these sort of scattered left-wing folkies, but mainstream in the sense that they're putting out records that are selling a significant amount of copies, and they're playing places like Carnegie Hall and Lincoln Center and things like that. It was really a very interesting place for them to be for those few years, though really hard to call it creatively good for them in that sense. Pete Seeger left during that era and was replaced by Eric Darling, who's also a fantastic banjo player, and they were a really great live band during those years, but didn't necessarily keep making hits in that same way. It was a very different phase of their career, but again, really, to me, it's really interesting.
Did the document...
And just to sort of tie that in a little bit to the Grateful Dead, actually, is that the Weavers' performances in the late 50s, in their first era when they were having their actual hits, they really performed at nightclubs and kind of like, restaurants at hotels and kind of like sort of upscale, supper club kind of places. But when they reunited, they were playing concerts, like where they were the sole attraction. And their shows became kind of centers of counterculture in kind of that way that Grateful Dead shows did. Not in the way that, people were necessarily selling things outside, but it became this place where you could go to this concert and know that you were going to kind of meet people from a like-minded community. And that it spawned other things. Okay. And it was part of you knew that you were part of this bigger world by going to see the Weavers. Like lots of bands. That is how the Kingston Trio started. Is that they went, two of them saw a Weaver show and say they were profoundly transformed by it. And I no reason to doubt that. Peter, Paul, and Mary grew out of one of the Weavers reunion shows. There was this. They were kind of a real center. Yeah.
Did the documentary deal with the blacklisting?
A little bit, not as much as I would have liked it. The documentary is very much about the reunion, which was in 1980. By which point Lee Hayes, who, now that I say his name out loud, I don't think I've said out loud yet this interview. He was the other real force in the Weavers, along with Pete Seeger. He and Pete Seeger were kind of the two senior members of the band. They'd both been in the Almanac Singers, which was the group with Woody Guthrie that existed in before World War II. And Lee is a really complicated person. Was a really complicated person, and even looking through his materials now, is still a complicated person. He was definitely an alcoholic. He was probably gay and didn't quite having grown up in the South in the 20s just couldn't come to grips with that really in any so it was basically asexual in some ways. So he kind of when the Weavers broke up in 1963, he kind of retired. That was the official line. He retired. He moved out of New York City and by the late 70s was really kind of not in the best of health. He had both of his legs amputated because of diabetes and was clearly kind of on the way out. So the film wasn't at a time. It was very much about the Weavers reuniting around Lee, who is just, I just said this a few minutes ago about Harold Leventhal, but he's someone who I really wish I could have, talked to or hung out with. He's listening to his, I've been saying this across the interview, there's something very cornball kind of about the Weavers. But even though that's true, Lee was kind of their MC. He was kind of live. He was the guy who would do the crowd work. And he has this sense of humor that I can't, it's very Southern. There's a lot of sort of gallows humor to it. It's very dark and kind of surreal. And to me, it still translates in a way that they're written jokes with punchlines, but there's this sensibility to it that's, it's self-effacing, and like I said, that kind of the dark undercurrents because underneath all of what the Weavers did, and there's just something very modern about his. I feel like I could explain my life to Lee Hayes, and he would sort of understand what was, understand it. Like that, even though he was born in, I don't know, 1910 or something in Arkansas.
Did you said before we were recording that the story of the Weavers makes you feel optimistic or inspired? How so?
That they were destroyed by the American government, by the Blacklist, by being harassed by right-wing media and called to testify. Like that's about that just personal. It's just what happened to them is just awful to me. To be a creative person and somehow be accused of being, unfaithful to your country or conspiring to destroy it. When Pete Seeger really genuinely wanted to transform it through democracy. Like that was, and the idea that they could be so persecuted and then come through it on the other side and come back together and then inspire all these people who followed them and to use their voices to continue, raising awareness for the issues that they were singing about. That's really, that is inspiring to me. And that they were, especially in the Pete Seeger era, they were a global voice. And that was the idea that somebody could champion voices from around the world, that, like a South African song or a South American song or an Eastern European song, that these songs could have the same value as an American pop song, was really, that by itself, that idea was considered controversial. And that was, if you expressed solidarity with people from other countries, you were thought of as a communist. That was part of it. And the notion that the Weavers helped create this global network of musicians is so powerful to me, that they could, even with all this malarkey about copyright and whatever, that they could sort of seed these networks, that they could, make friends in other countries and connect all of these things into a world that was almost beyond politics. Like, that's incredibly inspiring to me. I pulled this out before. I'll describe it. So I mentioned before I interviewed Pete Seeger, and we interacted a little bit. One of the things that I was able to do that made me really happy was introduce him indirectly to Gilberto Gil, who was he was a Brazilian musician in the 60s and early 70s who was a political dissident and jailed in Brazil, and eventually became their minister of culture. And he came up in the conversation with Pete, and I was able to introduce him. So Pete and I ended up writing a couple postcards back and forth. Okay. I sent him the article. So he sent me this postcard that I have here, How to Build Global Community. And it's, they're hippie pro tips, but they're all great. They're all, be skeptical about what you read. Question military corporate connections. But right at the top of the list are a couple of things that I had been starting to do around the time that I interviewed Pete. Imagine other cultures through their poetry and novels. Listen to music you don't understand and dance to it. And that's something that I had been starting to do around then, as maybe proven by the fact that I was listening to Gilberto Gil and this Brazilian, psychedelic political music from the 60s that I didn't understand, but was super groovy and experimental. And it became this entrance point into me understanding more about Brazilian politics in the 60s and the 70s and in the present. That music is this doorway that's way richer than politics. Trying to understand like another country through their system of government or through their like incredibly convoluted decades of, various racial or sexual biases or whatever, it's not that fun. And it's I never feel like if I'm just reading about a country through like whatever their topics of debate are, I never really feel like I understand that country in a way that like I understand where I'm from. And that statement really crystallized this idea, the statement about, listen to music you don't understand, crystallized this idea for me that you can that's the doorway. Like that, this was around the time I got this postcard, was kind of the aftermath of the second Gulf War. And there's this great label called Sublime Frequencies that the Sun City Girls started, where they're putting out these collections of music from, Iraq and Afghanistan and the Middle East, and it's pop music. And listening to that music as a way to kind of understand the texture of that culture. It's it's not like you can't just listen to it and be like, oh yeah, I understand Iraqi culture now, obviously. But it's such an important way to get into that, because it's your music as a force is something that you can self-identify with. It's not something that's or it can be. It's not often people who are musicians in the global sense aren't. It's not something that's forced on them. It's their identity in a way that they have chosen. And in that sense, you're engaging with music from another country. You're engaging in on their terms.
Yeah.
It's not
like the heart of people.
It's not like you're looking at that country in like a diminutive, touristy kind of way. I mean, unless you're just watching a band play in a tourist bar. But if you're actually engaging with that music, like that, to me, that's like engaging with another culture on like its actual level, even if you don't understand it, but just making the musical equivalent of eye contact with that music is. And the Weavers, to me, without knowing it at the time when I was listening to them when I was a kid, that's where there's no other place that came from in my musical education. Like, and then like getting this postcard from Pete, I'll flick it on mic to give it some physicality. Was a pretty big thing for me. Just like having that idea like written out, and the fact that it came from him. So that's where I find a lot of optimism in the Weavers.
Great. Do you see a connection, through line between your books and what you're looking to say or look for in writing a book?
I definitely see a through line between the three books, and definitely probably that speaks to what I'm interested in about American culture, which is to say counterculture. The idea that there can be a culture within the broader culture whose goal is to then transform the culture around it through its music, through its writing practices, through its publishing, through its all these different methods. And that to me, that's the like an absolute like connective through line between the Weavers. Pete Seeger and Lee Hayes being involved in were involved in an organization called People's Songs, which was the direct idea that they would transform society through music. And then you see that picking up in the Grateful Dead world, and it's attached to psychedelics and it's attached to all these other ideas, but music is really still a core currency in the middle of that idea of transformation. And Yo La Tengo, the topic of my first book, I used them as kind of a springboard to talk about the rise of indie rock in the United States. And I mean that in the sort of more in the economic sense than the genre sense, in the Pandora sense that there's now a genre called indie rock, in the idea that there was do-it-yourself networks of people doing college radio shows and running their own record labels and putting out zines and things like that, that they were really trying to find this sort of middle path through culture that wasn't quite, this monolithic mainstream corporate thing where everything has to be like where the end goal is to play in a baseball stadium and put out hit records. The idea is that, music can be this, this normal part of life that's both normal and not normal at all. That's like, both part of the everyday, but, shines light on the sublime or something like that.
Okay.
And, certainly Yo La Tengo are not quite as obviously transformative on American culture as the Weavers or the Grateful Dead, but in kind of this small, local, individualistic way, I feel that way about them. So that was that was part of why I wanted to write that book was. So I'm interested in counterculture in many of its forms. This idea that there's this world outside what is sanctioned by the main, the sort of the dominant culture at the time, that there's always people doing something that's at an angle to that they're finding ways to connect with each other outside of official systems and outside of things like Spotify. I don't know, the idea that there's this big monolithic thing that lots of people, that's how it seems like most people listen to their music now, is Spotify. But at the same time, there's also all kinds of really interesting things happening outside of that through unofficial channels in ways that are being documented through mediums and platforms that are probably going to prove to be pretty ephemeral. And so to me, that's where sort of the history is happening.
Yeah.
It's certainly not at the U2 show.
And you don't have to say what, but do you already have an idea for the next book? And
yeah, things that I'm batting around.
Thinking stage, research stage.
Thinking, well, it depends on whether or not somebody wants it to be a book or not.
Okay.
So probably it's hard to say. I mean, always thinking about things. Even writing these 3 books, always lots of other projects going on, either in practice or just in my head.
Yeah.
But yeah.
Okay.
I enjoy the medium of books in every way. I'm a enormous reader of books. Like I have been my whole life. It's a form that I love. And as it turns out, writing them is, to me, just as satisfying as reading them. More satisfying than reading them, probably. But just the idea that I can sink into something that takes a really long time and takes a lot of thought and takes a lot of creative planning to sort of to pull out a story is I'm really attracted to that. I like writing. I like writing. Period. I like writing articles. I like writing really anything. But books there's just something that's still magical to me. About books.
And as a big reader, what are you reading now, or recently that has excited you?
Let me give me a second. I actually keep a list on my computer of everything that I've read that goes back years and years and years. So that's the easiest way to.
Yeah. So a few titles.
So totally. I mean, so I have to say, having just spent basically 8 or 9 years writing books fairly continuously, where during that period I was reading nothing but research for those books. I'm kind of in perpetual catch-up mode where I'm reading things that are several years old at this point. So that's a long setup to let's see, what can I highlight out of my recent reading list that illustrates anything. I just read Jeff Tweedy's memoir.
Okay. I just got the advanced copy of that. I'm looking forward to reading that.
Yeah, that's okay, so that's a little theme. I've read a couple of recovery memoirs recently, music recovery memoirs, and they all have their, everybody is different, everybody's recovery is different.
Yeah.
And Jeff Tweedy's is great. I don't know, if you're a Wilco fan or not, but he's a very conversational person. It's a lot like a Wilco show or a Jeff Tweedy show without the songs. But it's really, you get that very personal vibe from it, and he's very, very thoughtful. I've been so I also read on that front. I read The Hard Stuff, which is Wayne Kramer from the MC5's memoir, which is a lot more depressing than the Jeff Tweedy memoir. I'll note that I share a publisher with the Wayne Kramer memoir, which is the excellent Capo Press. But the Wayne Kramer memoir takes a dark turn in the sense that Wilco, Jeff, everybody bottoms out in in a way that's you can't say that one is worse than the other, which is actually a point that you really get out of Jeff's book. But man, did Wayne Kramer crash hard, and it's really it's really depressing. After reading, because the MC5, who are his band, were very much, he doesn't talk about the Weavers in his book, but they're very much sort of picking up that firebrand or whatever. But going way harder than the Weavers did, and they went straight. Yeah. Oh man, the MC5 kind of ran straight into the wall doing that. But I've been, like I said, I've been catching up on a lot of other books that I've been wanting to read for years. Some of them, music related, some of them not.
Let's get another music related one.
One that I just read recently is Love to Burn, which is Paul Williams' book about Neil Young. Do you know Paul Williams? Paul Williams, for people who aren't familiar with Paul Williams, one of the parents of contemporary music journalism. Crawdaddy was the first real critical music magazine, and he passed away a couple years ago. He spent his career really obsessing over a couple of artists. He's written he wrote 4 or 5 books about Bob Dylan, which are all amazing. He wrote a bunch about Philip K. Dick, not a musical artist, obviously, but really getting inside that stuff in a very emotional, personal way. Where he wrote a book, one of his books is about Bob Dylan in the 80s, and I love Bob Dylan. But I have, like a lot of people, I'm not totally sold on his output from the 1980s. However, reading Paul Williams about it, he's so enthusiastic and so engaged with it. And I think that has to do with being there in real time. But so willing to go down whatever path Dylan was going down and ascribe meaning to it, even if that wasn't what Dylan was doing. That I love. I love finding an emotional center to music that is often that people don't like, or music from artists that people you know what I mean, like bad, supposedly bad work from great musicians,
and that maybe this will make you look at it in a different way or reconsider it.
And it absolutely does, because with Paul Williams, because of the way he is so inside. Well, I don't know. It's hard to say if he's inside Bob Dylan's head or if he's inside his version of Bob Dylan's head. I've been on in addition to the Weavers and the Grateful Dead and all this, I've been on an extended Neil Young bender for the last few years. Actually listened live Crazy Horse bootlegs were a soundtrack for at least a good chunk of the early writing of the Weavers book. Just their really pulsing, pounding stuff. So I finally read Paul Williams' book on Neil Young. I was homesick a few weekends ago. Stayed on the couch all day, just read the whole book in one day. And it's basically his articles about Neil Young from over the years, in real time. And then the other part of it is him. This is written in the 90s, back when sort of bootleg box sets were a thing. And he kind of takes this what sounds like a really excellent Neil Young bootleg CD box set and breaks it down track by track, but in a way that's to me, I found very compelling. And he's connecting to it.
Okay. Well, those are some great choices.
Thanks.
Jesse, thank you. So where's people can keep up with you? The book's coming out Election Day? Is
book's
that right?
out on Election Day.
Yes.
Yeah, I should have mentioned that before. It's coming out on Election Day from the Capo Press. You can follow me. You can check out what I've been doing at my website, jessejarnow.com, JESSEJARNOW.com. And I'm pretty active on Twitter. Boujwick is my handle, BOURGWICK. I host probably the time this comes out, it's not going to be weekly anymore, but I have been hosting a weekly or a every other week podcast called Alternate Roots, which is all music that's not on Spotify, sort of kind of an attempt to kind of trace that notion of counterculture, like I was mentioning before. Those are kind of the big places. Oh, and I host a weekly radio show on WFMU, late Monday nights from midnight to 3 a.m., technically Tuesday mornings. And you can hear, if you don't happen to be up at those hours in Eastern Standard Time, you can hear those archived on WFMU's website, WFMU.org, and their handy free app on Android and iPhone.
Sounds good.
Get all those plugs in.
Yes.
Bam, bam, bam.
And we will double down and put that in the show notes.
Oh, great.
Well, thank you, Jesse. The book is incredible. I highly recommend it.
Thanks so much.
Congrats on getting it out there, all the work you did. And thank you for doing this.
Yeah, my pleasure.
There you have it, my conversation with Jesse Jarnow. Get the book out Election Day now. Wasn't that a time? The Weavers, the Blacklist, and the Battle for the Soul of America. Check out Jesse online at jessejarnow.com. JESSEJARNOW. I'm online, talkmusictalk.com for more podcast information. Also, I am on social media at Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter as This Is Boyce, BOICE. And if you enjoyed this episode with Jesse, please share it on social media or leave a 5-star rating and or review, because this helps to increase the Talk Music Talk audience. You can also download the Talk Music Talk app wherever you like to get your apps. It is free, or you can stream the podcast pretty much everywhere: iTunes, Spotify, Google Play, iHeartRadio, Stitcher, everywhere. I tell you, just search for Talk Music Talk. You can also find the podcast on SoundCloud at soundcloud.com/This Is Boyce, starting with episode 100. And I make music, so you can check out my music at that SoundCloud link. Thank you so much for listening. Until next time, and there will be a next time, this one's for you, Liz.